Hi, my name is Mark Antakli. I'm a candidate for treasurer in Bloomfield Township, Michigan. Please go out and vote on the Republican ballot August 4th, 2020. I look forward to earning your trust. Here's a short video about some of the things happening in township affairs. Today we'll look at the Milliman update to the OPEB actuary and we'll walk through the changes. Let's start with what an actuary does and how it helps the township. So the actuary, it helps the township to develop long-term expectations with respect to liabilities. So in this particular case, we are looking at the healthcare liability for the retirees. The actuary looks at what are the expected expenditures and benefit payouts, the expected return on investments, should contributions be made into the fund to help cover the expenditures and benefit payouts. It also looks at funding ratios. So how much do we have in the account to cover future liabilities? Items that the actuary will consider are expectations when people will terminate employment, when individuals will retire, when individuals pass away. And they'll also look at what are the expectations with respect to healthcare costs. So will healthcare costs go up? Will healthcare costs go down? And then adjustments are made based on what actually happens. This is the backdrop of what's been occurring recently in the township. And I know these letters go back about 2 years, but the township really hasn't had a plan on how to fund the healthcare retirement benefit. And what we see here are 2 letters from the Department of Treasury for the state of Michigan. This one is dated March 2018, and it's the underfunded status of our retirement system. On December 28, 2018, we see that a corrective action plan was not approved, and the email went to Leo Savoy. We also note down here that the plan did not hit a 40% funded ratio, and the plan did not hit even a 25% funded ratio. So this is the importance of why these actuaries are required, because it helps with long-term financial planning. This is the highlight from what Milliman was discussing in the board meeting on June 22nd. So what they first talked about was the 2018 valuation and then moving it forward to the current baseline. And these are the 2 critical areas that the Department of Treasury is worried about, is the funded ratio and the unfunded accrued liabilities. Okay? So Milliman told us, we look at what today's liabilities would be if all expectations were realized since 2018. So if all the expectations that Milliman had back in 2018 were realized, where would we be today? And that establishes the baseline. Then what Milliman does is they go back and they say, when outcomes vary from expectations in 2018, in that actuary, we have to say, let's make adjustments moving forward. And that's what Milliman has done. They took a look at what adjustments needed to be made based on what was increasing or decreasing more than expectations. And they also look at the ratios and the funding requirements for the post-employment benefit. So the first item that they looked at was updating the healthcare cost factors. So again, this had a good impact for us. We see here that the liabilities went down about 2.8 million, and it helps our funding ratio. So why did the healthcare cost factors change? Well, in 2018, the healthcare cost increases were expected to increase 5% to 5.5% annually from 2018 to 2020. And what happened actually to our accounts? So for the PPO, there was a decrease of 1% in the first year, and then in the second year, it decreased 2%. For the HRA account, we see that it increased 2.5% in the first year, and in the second year, it increased 4.5%. In both situations, the increases were less than expected. And then decreases are always good, and that rarely happens. A lot of that had to do with some of the changes the federal government made to the Affordable Care Act. So the township benefits with the reduced liabilities of about $27.8 million, so which is great for the township. The next item that Milliman looked at was the medical trend. So here we see the column with the medical trend, and here we see the no excise tax. And then let's look at, again, the funding improves, and we have a benefit, a reduction in the liability of about $16 million. So what happened? The federal government will no longer implement the excise tax. Remember, the excise tax was known as the Cadillac Tax in the Affordable Care Act. So since 2018, that's been removed. So we can take all of the expenses related to the Cadillac tax and this excise tax out of the OPEB liability. So that ends up reducing the actuary liability by close to $16 million. Thank you, federal government, for helping us to remove this tax. Great for the township. The next thing Milliman looked at was mortality tables and the improvement scale. And this is where it's updated. We see the improvements here, and for both the impact to the liabilities and the impact to the funded ratios. So why did that happen? Well, we have new data, and new data helps us make better estimates. There was a study that was started back in 2010. The study was finally completed, and this is directly related to public institutions, and which helps us because we have better data for our group of employees. We also have a new mortality improvement scale. So we went from the scale BB to the MP 2019, and then the mortality table, we went from the RP 2000 to the PUB 2010. What this does is it changes our actuarial expectations again. With the new data, we have a reduction in liability of about $2.5 million. Great for the township. We have new data from our actuary, and it helps reduce the expected liabilities. The last item we look at here is the reflect funded discount rate. And see the 6%? We're going to talk about why that's 6%. And look at this benefit, $31.6 million, about $31.6 million reduction in liability. Look at how that funded ratio improves. This is all because of the pressure that was placed on the township by the Michigan Department of Treasury. Remember, they sent out that letter in 2018 underfunded status. They weren't happy with the initial corrective action plan that was provided. They forced the township to take a second look at it, and what happened? So the funded discount rate was 4%. That 4% in 2018 was based on the current assets and based on how they're being invested at that point in time. And the expectation was a 4% return. Now, due to the corrective action plan, the township is required to place an additional $2 million annually into that fund to help us get to the 40% funded rate requirement. Now, those are taxpayer dollars. Those are our dollars that are going into the account. And what happens is, because we're doing that contribution, the return on the assets go up because we're putting in more money. So just like your 401k account, Your assets go up when you put in more money in our liabilities. The more money we put into the fund, our liabilities go down because we have more assets to cover future expectations with respect to benefit payouts. So what is the bottom line impact? Because of what the Department of Treasury wanted the township to do, it reduces that by about 31.6 million. That's a 31.6 million reduction, all because of what the Department of Treasury wanted the township to do. We kicked the can down the road, and now we see that benefit. So here we see on June 11, 2019, we see the notice of approval from the Department of Treasury. And again, that letter went out to Leo Savoy. And again, here to Leo Savoy, the Department of Treasury is keeping tabs on what's happening to our corrective action plan. Are we keeping pace? Well, we're still waiting for the final Milliman actuary report. And what we want to do is take a look at the long-term plan. What are the liabilities? What are the benefit payouts? What are the funded ratios? And how the contribution of $2 million annually, how that impacts the future liabilities. And you have to remember that contribution cannot be used to pay benefits. That contribution is required to improve the funded ratio. Recall my video about over $8 million goes out of public safety. About $1.5 million was undisclosed. Those funds were going out of public safety. We have millions of transfers going into the general fund. And even if you look at the general fund, there's about $500,000 of undisclosed transfers out of the general fund. So 1.5, 500,000, that's 2 million. So even in the budget for this year, the transfers are going out, but we were never told what that $2 million was for, and I believe it's for OPEB. And why the deception of how OPEB is being funded by the township? Recall the video, the $2.7 million budget deficit. Recall the surplus and safety path and how that's going to show, I believe that will show that we have a surplus for the year ending March 31, 2020. Well, guess what? If those funds were actually used for what they were supposed to, we would have a deficit, and the township was required to pay $2 million into the OPEB requirement for the health care. Which brings to another question, or something to consider. What about the pension trust actuary? What were those contributions? And how were those funded? Where's the cash coming from? Why was the SAD required? What were we told, and why was the SAD required? What were we told, and why was the March 10 millage needed? We see the money going out, and now we see the money being used for the OPEB liability. Well, that's a much different story. We need the cash to cover the post-employment benefit, as opposed to we need the funds to pay salaries for police and fire. And then what about these 6-year contracts that were signed during the shutdown that we had because of the lockdown? 6-year contracts, compounded salary increases of over 15%. We're not properly funding the post-retirement benefits. A lot of questions to ask. And we're signing these contracts that, where's the money going to come from? Again, more questions to ask. So I think change is needed. Change is needed in Bloomfield Township. Please go out and vote on the Republican ballot on August 4, 2020, or earlier by absentee ballot. Vote for Mark Antakli for treasurer.